As always, let me remind you to begin with that this is a rating summary of The Accountant. It's not an actual review, although I will give you my thoughts on the film at the end if you want to stick around. So the film has mostly been rated for violence, and yeah, it is a fairly violent film. Mostly the violence is gun violence, although there is hand-to-hand combat fighting and where people get punched and kicked and wrestled and thrown over balconies and all that sort of stuff, but most of it is gun violence. So, and it's pretty heavy and pretty consistent through the whole film. The body count does get higher and higher as the film goes on. So the film actually opens with a scene where someone's walking in to some kind of violent act seems to be in progress. And in this opening scene, you actually see some dead bodies on the ground. You see them in pools of blood and blood all over them. And then going up the stairs, the same kind of thing. So this pretty much sets the tone for the rest of the film. So you kind of know what to expect from that very first scene. The interesting thing about the film is that it's one of those films where it wants to be violent, but it also doesn't really want to upset you with the violence. So some of it is actually quite funny, weirdly enough. So you'll see people being shot in the face, point blank in the face, but it's done in a kind of a comic way. So if you're really worried about the gun violence, just be aware that it's presented in a way where they try and tone it down for you to make it a little bit amusing and watchable and not particularly harrowing, if that makes any sense. So, as I said, this continues quite heavily through the film, mostly the gun-related violence, but there are other scenes of violence. One such scene is a torture scene where you see a man who has been tied down. You know that he has been tortured. You do see him being shot with a nail gun, which goes into his hand, and he screams. This man is covered in blood, so you understand that he has been tortured by the men that are around him for quite a while. And the scene ends with a man lighting a blowtorch. And then, a little bit later, you see this victim then in a body bag, and it explains that his body was found burnt and severely beaten and tortured. So there's that little scene in there as well. And there's mention of violent things through the film. So there's mention of, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, excuse me. There's mention of, drug cartels and, drug families and big crime families. So there's references to that. There's someone tells a story about someone that they'd given drugs to knock them out, and then they'd locked them in the trunk of a car for a few days. And even though they survived, they were quite, sort of severely cooked, if you like. So there's stories which are told of violence. You see two young boys who undergo a lot of weapons and combat training. They're forced to do this by their father. So you see boys fighting, and it's quite severe as well. They really get into it. So they're covered in little cuts and bruises and blood and all of that. You see some street fighting, or some younger boys, maybe teenager boys, are fighting in the streets. And so, again, the violence isn't just for adults. The children are involved as well. There's another scene where someone is kind of, hit with objects and then sort of near strangled, and then you hear the neck snap as their neck is broken. So that kind of, sums it up, I think, just how broad it can be at times. And, it can be a little bit graphic, but as I said, it does this weird thing where it tries not to shock you too much. So it tones it down a little bit, and at times actually makes you laugh. So I mentioned blood. It isn't a hugely bloody film, although there is a fair bit of blood, I suppose. You'll see bloody heads and noses and knees. So there's some bloody bullet wounds and things like that. And you actually see someone tying a belt around their leg as the bullet wound is bleeding. It's nowhere near horror themes of levels of blood, but yeah, there's a little bit of blood, like bloody knees and scratches and all that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't say it's a strong visual in the film. So let's go on to sex and nudity. There isn't any sex scenes anywhere in the film, and there's not really any nudity. You do see you see a poster of a shirtless man. Let's say he's a very famous boxer, and he's in the ring. And when the boys are having a scrape and wrestling, there's one boy in particular you do see without his shirt on, but that really is it in terms of sex or nudity. A bit of flirting maybe at one point in the film, but nothing else. So not much to worry about there if that's the sort of stuff that you don't want to see on screen. Drugs and alcohol. So as I kind of touched on earlier, there's a few references to drugs. So there's discussions about drug cartels and drug families and drug deals going down, all that kind of stuff. But you don't actually see any illegal drugs in the film. or any illegal drug taking. There is one man who takes some Zoloft pills in the film, and there's a scene where, and I guess this ties into the violence a little bit, there's a scene where a diabetic is bribed or blackmailed into overdosing on insulin. So you do see the vials of insulin and you see the syringe. You don't actually see the suicide or the injection take place, but then the next scene they're discussing this man's death. So there is a strong suicide reference in the film attached to this scene, and you do see the insulin drug there as well. Alcohol, yeah, there isn't really alcohol in the film. The only, thing I even spotted in the film is in the background of one scene, there's some bottles of alcohol on a shelf. So that's it. There's no alcohol in the film. Onto language. Yeah, it's pretty profane, I suppose. I mean, there's quite a few F words through the film, and S words and A words and son of a bitch and that sort of stuff. I didn't find it particularly heavy, particularly for this kind of strong action heavy film. But yeah, there's certainly some swearing in the film as well. So about the film itself, it's kind of a weird film. It does this strange thing. The main protagonist suffers from high-functioning autism. Now, I don't have an autistic child, so I don't want to comment. I don't want to pretend to understand what it is like being the parent of an autistic child, or even being that child themselves. But it's interesting. Some of the film is so refreshing in the way it handles how difficult it must be to live in this environment, and that's quite nice and quite refreshing, and really, really, really easy to get into and follow, and I'm quite welcome to see that on screen. But I guess because this guy ends up becoming a very hardened killer, and quite expert killer, it's just that though the film doesn't want to say that because you suffer from autism, then you're capable of being a killing machine, because that might be offensive. So then there's this weird thing where it tries to pull back on all of that and then sort of make it a little bit comic, just to get your mind off the severity of what they might actually be saying here. So at times it's like, yeah, I like what they're doing here. Then it's like, well, it just goes ludicrous in parts. I know that probably doesn't make much sense to you because, if you haven't seen the film, but hopefully you'll get what I mean when you do see the film. So it wants to be this, action movie, which is, serious and silly. And at times it knows that it's how silly it is, and it has a bit of fun with that. But then at other times it just gets ludicrous. I mean, there's a plot twist or a reveal at the end, which is just absurd. And, they even try and hide it a little bit so that you can't see it coming by throwing this red herring out there. And by the time you sort of work that out, you're like, I know what's going on here. So you kind of feel more cheated than anything when they do finally show what they were wanting to reveal to you, and you just don't care. It really isn't that impressive. It's kind of eye-rolling. In fact, there were people around me who groaned when they kind of revealed this little plot twist. So silliness like that just, I think, brings the film down a little bit. Still, the acting's good, and it is fun. You will enjoy the film, and don't get me wrong, it is quite engaging and it's easy to watch. It is very long though. It's over 2 hours, and man, it takes its sweet time to get going. I mean, the first half hour is a bit of a slog in parts, so it does take its time. But once the action starts, the action's really well choreographed and quite interesting. It's also shot in that sort of darky, bleak kind of world, which will appeal to some, and then others will sort of love the idea that it's not trying to make itself appear all rosy and, with lots of lens flare. So I guess it depends on, what you like to see yourself, when it comes to action in the cinema. Anyway, that's my thoughts on The Accountant. If you want to know more about the film or the content in the film, then check out the website, which is cinemum.net.